Hello and welcome to Secrets Mystery Manor. I'm your host, Psychic Zelda Kelly.
It's time for the disclaimer. Warning, the following presentation is intended for mature audiences. It may contain strong description of crime scenes, adult dialogue, and possible strong language. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello and welcome. Welcome back to Secrets Mystery Manor. I missed you. How are you? How have you been getting along so far in this fall? Today is November 30th. Oh my gosh, where has the time gone? But it is beautiful where I'm recording right now, which I am visiting Georgia, and it is very, very nice. And in the fall time of the year, I get to thinking and reminiscing of my hometown and the surrounding area and family and people. You know how it is. It's like, what they said in the movie, when it's time for school, just the smell of pencils makes you remember so much more. Maybe we don't have pencils in schools anymore, but that does mean a lot. So today's episode is going to be the Ghost of Malabar. Now, I'm going to explain what Malabar is later on in the episode. But I think this is going to be very interesting and a lot of history. So we may as well just get started. Don't you think? Don't you agree? So pull up your chair, get your snacks ready, get your little blankie, start the fire. If you don't have the fire, turn on one of those beautiful fire similes on the TV and let's get started. But I'm glad you're here. So, the first story that I have for you is a very sad story, similar story, and I'm sure things have been this way worldwide, but this takes place in the late 1800s, or starts in the 1800s. Late 1800s. So, on March 13th of 1873, a young girl, a little baby, of course she was young, a little baby by the name of Celia Rose was born to David and Rebecca Rose in Richland County, Ohio. Now, this is a very, very sad story, and I have to say that. So, moving ahead. So Celia, or they called her Ceely Rose, was residing with her family. Now, she had a brother, Walter, that was 17 years older than she was, and who actually fought in the Civil War. That's really something to think about, isn't it? So she has a brother who fought in the Civil War, and I think there were 7 children who were younger than she. So, yeah, they had a big family. So they lived on this farm in Pleasant Valley, Ohio, which is now known to be Mansfield, Ohio, and maybe even Lucas, somewhere right around in there, okay? Sometimes it's hard to divide those lines. When I was growing up, we always thought it to be Lucas. I think it's technically Mansfield. Whatever the case may be, they lived there in Pleasant Valley, which is no longer there, but now it is Lucas and Mansfield. Okay, now that we've got MapQuest worked out, right? Okay, so Ceely, they always said that she was a very special child. They said that she was silly, and one person described her as being half child and half woman. So in 1896, in the early summer of 1896, tragedy started to strike this family. But before that, I want to tell you what really happened and what was really going through Ceely's mind. Ceely was not really attractive. She was cute, and I'm going to post a picture of her. I think today's standards, I think she was cute. But the boys, the girls, kids would shame her, ridicule her, make fun of her, give her a hard time. And so nobody really liked her. She didn't have any friends, which is really, really sad. But they said that she was just an awkward young lady, and the boys would tease her and pretend that they wanted to go out with her, and it would just hurt her feelings really, really bad. Then she met this young man. His name was Guy Barry, who lived on a neighboring farm and was about 5 years younger than Ceely. And Guy would be polite to her. He felt sorry for her. His family, felt sorry for her. And so they just, accepted that Ceely started to have a crush on Guy. Well, this crush became almost too much. It was then every day. Literally every day, Ceely would be there with Guy on the farm, go down to see him, all these things. Well, Guy was polite, and he endured, and that's what they said, he endured these visits. But it got to the point where it was just so much, and Guy's father was very much less tolerant of Ceely. And so he went to Ceely's parents and asked Ceely to stay away. So Ceely's parents were really ashamed and struck, and that's Benji meowing if you can hear her, and was really, really upset and forbid Ceely to go and visit Guy on the farm. Well, they thought everything was nice and wonderful and all that stuff until Ceely was so upset that she was not allowed to be there. Now, Ceely was about 23 years old at this time. So, she wasn't like 16 or 17. She was 23, still living at home, and most likely would have been under the care of her parents continuously. So her father, who was David Rose, ran a mill in Pleasant Valley. And so Ceely had an idea one late summer day, or late June day rather, to soak cottage cheese in poison for rats. It was actually called Rough Rat, and I'm going to post a couple of ads for Rough Rat. Now we understand that was almost purely arsenic that was in that Rough Rat that got rid of rats, and it says it gets rid of flies and rats and bed bugs and a lot more. It served its purpose. It got really, really used. So Ceely soaked Rough Rat in the cottage cheese, and this one morning, David was eating the cottage cheese, and he died. He died June 30th. And now Walter Rose, Ceely's 17 years older brother, survived until July 4th, and he passed away on July 4th. By this time, Rebecca Rose, who is the mother, was apparently catching on to what was going on, because Ceely was very agitated and very upset that she could not go see Guy. She blamed them for having lost what she felt was a chance of being a wife and a mother, and she was going to take care of the situation. So Rebecca found out about this. She guessed it because Rebecca didn't eat much of the cottage cheese. So she figured this out. And so as this went on, Rebecca tried to protect Ceely. Now, talk about mother's love, right? But I think at that time, she probably figured it was going to be really bad outcome for Ceely. So Ceely decided to really amp up her plan. And she really dosed Rebecca with a huge amount of arsenic. And Rebecca, who was Ceely's mother, died July 19th. And from what I understand, this was a very agonizing death. And Ceely stood by and watched each one of them die from the arsenic. Yikes. So this was very suspicious to the neighbors and especially to Guy Barry's family. I mean, they were almost frightened to think what was going on. Everyone suspected Ceely. Well, Ceely stayed in the home. Now, I don't know what happened to the other children that they had. I don't know where they were, or there's no mention of the other children. Just Walter, who is her older brother by 17 years, David, the father, and Rebecca, who is the mother. So the law enforcement at that time decided that they were going to try to figure out what was going on. And they actually sent a reporter in, and who, I guess, befriended Ceely. And as they became closer, this reporter, this young lady, went to Ceely and said, you know, I really like this guy, and my parents don't want me to see him. Well, Ceely really liked her. She trusted her, and that was her friend. So she said, you know what? I have a plan, and I can tell you what I did. And I know I'm going to marry Guy Barry on the next farm. It's now just a matter of time. And she confessed exactly what she had done to David, Rebecca, and Walter. Well, this reporter went back to the authorities, and they arrested Ceely Rose. And this was basically the crime that shook Richland County. And one of the statements in the Richland Banner and Shield of August 15th of 1896 said, and I quote, "How fiendish must have been her hatred for them when she could deliberately kill them and stand by and watch them die. That such an act could be done in an enlightened century is sufficient to make pessimists of all kinds." Everyone was shocked. They all liked David, they all liked Walter, and I mean, Walter was a decorated Civil War Army soldier. So this was very shocking to them. So, of course, they knew that Ceely was not capable or able of standing trial. So, I want to get the date right. In 1896, that's right, in 1896, Ceely was sent to the Toledo Asylum. She was there for a long time, and she was transferred to Lima, Ohio, where she died nearly 20 years later. And when she died, no one claimed her body. There were still relatives left, is my understanding, but no one claimed her. No one went to see her. No one wanted anything to do with her. And she was buried in the asylum's state hospital graveyard. That's a sad ending, isn't it? But the whole thing was sad. Look at the family went through. The whole thing was sad. And it's my understanding that Guy Barry and his family moved away And it was very sad that they had felt like they had to move away to actually get away from the stigma that this whole thing had created. It was pretty sad. So as time went on, everybody kind of forgot what had happened. And the farm was still there. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but the farm was still there. And Guy Barry was actually still around, and he lived in Akron, Ohio until 1961. And he is buried in the same Pleasant Valley Cemetery as David, Rebecca, and Walter Rose. And it's said that if you go to the Pleasant Valley Cemetery, and I've been there, and you take pictures, you see nothing but orbs around, and especially around the cemetery or the gravestones of the Rose family. Now, I'm going to take a little sidestep here. You know me, I always have to fill you in the backstory, and that's what this is all about, right? So the backstory is, let's back up a few years to 1939. A Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Louis Bromfield, came back to Richland County and bought a big property in Pleasant Valley, and it also included the Rose family farm. So Louis Bromfield was a writer. For those of you who do not know Louis Bromfield, he was very popular in the 40s and into the 50s, and he was the author of Ferdinand the Bull for Disney. He authored And the Rains Came, and that was made into a movie, and that was an excellent, that starred George Papard. It was a wonderful movie. So he wrote a book, Pleasant Valley, and he included this particular story about Ceely Rose, and the next story that we're going to be talking about as soon as we're finished with Ceely. Now, I know some little extra things about this, and the reason being is because in 1941, my grandfather and grandmother went to work. My grandfather worked for the railroad and got a job as a farmer for Louis Bromfield on the farm. They built a big house there. It's now called the Big House. You can go on and the internet, and you can search Malabar Farm, and you're going to see this big, beautiful house. My grandparents worked there, and also in 1945, Louis Bromfield hosted the wedding of Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Now, my grandparents lived in another farm, not Ceely's, but in another farm adjacent to all of this. And, of course, this is my grandmother, who is the card reader. And my grandmother did not like the Hollywood vibe. She did not like that at all. So she stayed away. But my grandfather still had to farm. And one of the rules of Malabar Farm, or that Louis Bromfield had, was that when you visited there, you had to get up in the morning at 5 o'clock in the morning, and whatever chore that needed to be done, from feeding the chickens and making sure that the cows were milked and making sure that the horses were penned up and making sure that that everything was in the smokehouse, and there was a lot to do. I mean, this was a big working farm. Louis would write, and he had his office, but he had a big working farm too. And many of the kids that I went to school with, their families or fathers, grandfathers would also work for Louis Bromfield. Well, my grandmother would say, now my mother was little when they lived there. My mother was born in 1936, and they lived there in 1941. My grandparents did. And my grandfather helped Louis Bromfield with the Audubon Society. He was one who was very interested and involved in the Audubon Society. And it was my grandfather and Louis Bromfield who engineered the thought process of planting a big tree in the middle of your huge fields because it would help to soak up excess water, and your yield would be much bigger of your either corn or whatever soybean crop or whatever the case may be. They had a lot of corn down there at Malabar. So my grandmother, we used to take my mother for walks, and at that time there was no one living in Ceely Rose's home. And Ceely Rose's home, and I'm going to put a picture up here, is very close to the road now where you can drive through. And Ceely Rose, they would walk past there, and my grandmother would just say every time she would feel like someone was watching. And she couldn't even hardly look at the house because she was afraid if she looked at the house, she would see something. There were other people that reported that they would see something at the house, and especially looking out one particular bedroom window upstairs. Now, when you see this house, and I'm going to put this link up here, this house is old. I mean, this was, it's over 100 years old, probably close to 150 years old now. And it now belongs to the state because as of 1976, Malabar Farm and all the surrounding farms that belong to Louis Bromfield now are considered a state park. And it's very wonderful to be there. They have all kinds of little instances, little festivals and little events and everything else there. And my heart is with Malabar. I love that area down there. It's just so beautiful. But my grandmother would walk by. One day she decided when she had that feeling that she would walk by, and I'm going to put a picture. Most of you have seen it in my House of Zelda group, Facebook group, but I'm going to put a picture of my grandparents in there. They were actually standing in front of one of the barns of the farmhouse that they were living in at that particular time. So they, my grandmother and mother were walking by Ceely's house, and this one day my grandmother said that she just got this really odd, horrible feeling that, oh my gosh, somebody's looking at me, I just know it. You've had that feeling. I know you have. We all have, right? So she's had this feeling, and my grandmother turned around, and there were curtains still in the house. The curtain moved in the upper bedroom where people said that they saw. She saw like a little hand with a curtain push, like let the curtain go, like the curtain had been pushed back to look out at my grandmother and mother, and then when my grandmother looked, the curtain had been left go. Oh, it gives me chills to even think about it. And it bothered my grandmother because the first thing she thought of is, well, is there someone like camping out in the house? Because that happened a lot back then. If you had a vacant house, a lot of times people that, they would call a hobo, sorry, that's not offensive, but that's what they said then, would camp out in these houses. So she went and got my grandpa, and when my grandpa, who was attuned to this sort of thing, walked into the house, he heard someone walking upstairs. Well, my grandfather had a 16-gauge double-barrel shotgun with him. Nobody was going to mess with him. So he walked upstairs, nothing. And it was clear. My grandmother said it was extremely clear that you could hear this walking around. It wasn't just the house moving or the house settling, because old houses make noises. They moan and groan like we do when we get older. So my grandfather went upstairs and nothing. So this went on. My grandmother, now it became a mission. My grandmother wanted to see. So the next day, my grandmother would walk by and she would look on purpose and not seeing anything. And this went on for about 3 or 4 days. Finally, the last day that my grandmother decided to take this route past Ceely Rose's house, and you'll see, it's very, very close to the road, so it's like walking right in the front yard. My grandmother had that sensation again, that feeling that someone was watching her. And when she looked up at the window, there was a face looking down at her in this window. It's the top floor on the left-hand side. That face remained there. My grandmother had a stare down with a ghost. How do you like that? My grandmother stood there and looked. And finally, she said it was like it was there, and then in just like 0.3 of a second, it had disappeared. She went home and told my grandfather, which my grandfather told Louis Bromfield, and they decided to lock up that house for a little while and just make sure that no one was going in there and everybody was safe and everything else. And you can believe that my grandmother took my mother on her walks in a different pathway. They didn't go by that house. If they could help it, they did not go by that house. So that was one of those times that it was extremely tense for my grandmother because she was so in tune. And, of course, there were other things that had happened on that farm. And this, when you really think about it, wasn't too many years after the Civil War. Maybe 80, 100 years, maybe. Not even that. So there was a lot of activity around there and a lot of activity in the big house. There was a lot of Indians and around this area, like American Indians that were around this area too. So the grounds were charged with this energy. So my grandmother had a hard time. My grandmother and grandfather loved it there. And I've got to tell you this other little story, and then we'll move on to our next story of the ghost. When Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall got married at Malabar Farm, it was a big deal, but it wasn't really a big deal. They got married in the big house by the big staircase. They had this wonderful little reception. And my grandmother said that you could see that Lauren Bacall was so happy. Well, she loved Bogey. But she did not love getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do chores. And my grandfather said she cussed like a sailor. I gotta tell you, my grandfather did not like Lauren Bacall. She refused to go out and do chores. And finally, Bogey was able to get her to go out. And she did feed some chickens, and she did as little as she possibly could. She wanted to walk around. She was a Hollywood star. She was not going to get her hands dirty. But my grandfather said Humphrey Bogart was a different story. Can you believe that? He said he was a man's man. Outdoorsmen loved it. Called my grandfather by his first name, acted like they had been friends for a long time, said Bogey was just down to earth. And he would roll up his sleeves and get his hands dirty. And Lauren Bacall didn't like it. She would yell at him from the big house to get up there and get to spend some time with her. But he refused. He was up and at 'em every morning. And when they left, he was very sad to say goodbye to my grandpa. They became really, really good friends. I don't think that they heard from each other again, but that was a really good time. But I do know that at one time they had thought about building a small farm there in Ohio and actually bought some property. And I do think that Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart's son, Stephen Bogart, still owns some property there around Lucas, Ohio. I don't know what he's ever going to do with it. Probably keep it. But that's the story of them. Now, here's a little story. And because you may not really be able to place Malabar Farm, let me maybe help you. For those of you who have heard of the movie Shawshank Redemption, right? I mean, who hasn't heard of that movie? I believe it came out in 1994. long time ago. I went to the premiere in Mansfield, Ohio. But that was filmed, the beginning of that, where Andy was drunk and in the car and drove up to catch his wife with the golf pro. That was actually filmed on Malabar, and it was in a little area real close to the big house called Doris Duke Woods, and it was just beautiful. And in the end scene there where that one gentleman, I can't think of his name, oh my Lord, I'll think of it, is going on the bus, and he had just been paroled. He's on the bus, and he's starting to take the bus to go meet Andy. And Andy had sent him a message to go to this particular rock wall, to the tree. Morgan Freeman is his name. Thank you very much for giving me that. I know somebody's sitting there going, Morgan Freeman, Morgan Freeman. I got your message. Okay. So Morgan Freeman is on this bus, and he gets off in this field, and you see this long rock wall and this big tree, and he digs around this rock wall, and he finds the directions to go to the beach to meet Andy. That was also filmed near Malabar. That was filmed in a place called Butler, Ohio. Now, there is another point of this whole thing, and that is because of all of this goings on, and this was a state property. Now they have tourists that you can go and tour the big house. There's a shop online, and you can actually go and eat at one of the mills there that is really, really beautiful. And it's called the Malabar Inn. Now, what I have heard, and I don't know, I can't verify this because I don't know these people, but what I had heard was that they actually found another ghostly part of Malabar. And that's what we're going to talk about next. But before we get to that, I want to take this break for this very important message, and we'll come right back. See you soon. Hi everyone, this is your friend Zelda Kelly, and I would like to take a minute to invite you to stop over to Psychic Secrets. That's www.psychicsecrets.com. There you can find an advisor that can help you with advice, direction, and guidance that you need. And also you can read our blog, which has a lot of really, really good little articles and information, and can actually answer some questions for you. You can find us here on this same site, this Secrets Mystery Manor. We are there. So you're there already if you found us. But we also have another section, which is the Secrets Laws of Attraction. We have some wonderful videos up, and we would love to have you stop by and take a look at that. Now, I want you to know that Secrets really is here for helping the person. We have qualified, experienced advisors on call 24/7. We have the ability to chat. We have the ability to take a call, and actually even a video call if you feel so inclined. So stop on by to psychicsecrets.com. That's www.psychicsecrets, that's 2 S's in the middle now, psychicsecrets.com, and take advantage of our first-time offer. For those of you who have never called before, first-time customer, we have an offering of 30 minutes for $30. You know, we can get a lot accomplished in 30 minutes. I'm so glad that you stopped by today to listen to Secrets Mystery Manor. And I hope you take the invitation to come on over and check out our advisors. We're here for you. So thank you so much. And hopefully I'll see you soon, and you'll see me on there. I'm extension 11. So back to our podcast. Bye for now. Hello and welcome back. Thank you for giving us a moment to bring you that very important message. But before we get into our next story, I want to finish what I was telling you about Malabar and the Shawshank Redemption. And that is, do you remember the reformatory that Andy and Red, and that's Morgan Freeman, and the rest of them were at? Well, that was in the Mansfield Reformatory. And that is extremely haunted. And it's my understanding that some of the actors during the Shawshank Redemption filming had some real weird paranormal experiences when they were there. So we may do another podcast on that, but that has been the subject of many of our favorites going there. Like, well, Ghost Adventures has been there. Jason Hawes has been there with Ghost Hunters. Many, many paranormal groups have been there, and they come out with a lot of evidence. So, and more than orbs. So, I just wanted to share that with you. And now we're going to go into another part of Malabar. And this is located off of Old Possum Road. Hey, we're out in the country here, okay? So Old Possum Road. You drive back this long lane. Now you can get there from Malabar. And it winds back to the point where you think you're literally going nowhere. You really feel like you're well, getting ready to go to a place of no return. It gets spookier and spookier, and it gets windy, and this road is potted because, they don't really take care of it. There may be a tree down, there may be a branch down, whatever the case may be. Now, the story is of a lady by the name of Mary Jane Hendricks. This is Mary Jane's grave. Now, Mary Jane was born also in the 1800s. And I always wondered, it seems like Mary Jane and Ceely Rose lived at about the same time frame. I was always kind of curious to wonder if they had ever crossed paths. They were close enough, you never know. We probably will never know. Anyway, dear Mary Jane. So Mary Jane lived in this area that was actually called, well, they had these little bird names. There were two villages that were outside of this Malabar little area. It was called Hastings and Newville. And Mary Jane had relatives in the Hastings area. Now, Louis Bromfield writes in his book of Pleasant Valley that Mary Jane was a very odd woman and a very strange woman, and that they actually thought that she was a witch. And I'm going to put a picture here of Mary Jane, but of everything else that I've read about her, she was a very kind-hearted woman. Very something. Very something, It's amazing how some people's opinions can form. We won't know any of this about Mary Jane. But it seemed like Louis Bromfield described her as saying she was odd. She dressed odd. Sometimes she dressed in different clothing. And people stayed away from her because they really didn't understand her. She didn't have many friends. Wow. Now, that seems like that's I don't know, the theme of today, right? These two ladies with no friends. Now, Mary Jane didn't kill anyone. She didn't do any of these things. She was just this odd woman, and they said that if you wanted to, you could go to Mary Jane, and she would help you with certain herbs or something like that. She would make an herb necklace. There were other things that she would do. Relatively harmless. But anyway, so Mary Jane passed away on March 3rd. Isn't that amazing? These two ladies, March. Okay, so March 3rd of 1898, and was 72 years old, 5 months, and 1 day. Now, it's said that there was a young girl who felt sorry for Mary Jane because she too was picked on by locals. And I guess Mary Jane had died of cancer. And she was a good person, but this young woman took a real shining to her and really, really felt bad. So after Mary Jane was buried, this young girl took a pine seedling and planted it close to where Mary Jane's grave was. As time went on, the seedling became a tree, and the years have gone by. In the bark of the tree formed a heart, and it was facing Mary Jane's grave. Now, Mary Jane's grave, the headstone was turned backwards, which I wasn't so sure that that was so fair. Because we don't know, but you know how people get when they presume and assume they're going to do what they feel is best, and sometimes that's not the correct way it is. But anyway, unfortunately, her tombstone was turned backwards, so a lot of people felt sorry for Mary Jane. So this heart formed in this huge big pine tree. It was a beautiful tree, and this grave was desolate. I mean, out in the nowheres, desolate. You wouldn't even know it was there. If you drove by Old Possum Road, you wouldn't know that that is where you were heading. So let's fast forward. Here comes my grandmother again. I'm going to post that picture again. Here comes my grandmother. My mother and I, we were the three amigos when we would want to go and investigate, because I'll tell you what, if anybody loved ghost stories, it was my grandmother and my mother. And if you think I have plenty of them, I wish you could have been around to hear my grandmother tell them. Oh boy. And they were good ones too. They were the ones that would just scare you. So, I have a good memory that popped in and I have to share it. My grandmother and mother visited me when I lived in Virginia Beach, actually Chesapeake, Virginia. And I lived in a historic house. I bought a home that was the granddaughter of President Monroe. And this was back in the 80s. And at that time, the 80s, well, the granddaughter who I bought it off of was in a home, and she was about 92 years old. A delightful woman with plenty of history and stories as well. But her husband had built this home for them 70 years earlier. So this home was older to begin with, but this was in an area, once again, that had a lot of war around it, had a lot of American Indian energy. There was just a lot of military energy back from the Civil War and all this type of thing. And this was actually close to Fort Monroe, which has now been decommissioned as a military base, but that is a very historic area as well. So my grandmother and my mother came to visit me. We would sit in my living room and tell ghost stories. And we would hear knocks and all kinds of things in the basement. And I wouldn't go in the basement. And I remember my mother, we would make snacks, and my mother made the best homemade caramel corn you could ever wish to eat. It would just, knock the socks off of this stuff that you buy over the counter. It was the absolute best. And we would have that and snacks and Braunschweiger. Yeah, for those of you who know that. And crackers and cheese and all kinds of really good homemade goodies, because my grandmother would make the crackers. There you go. We're sitting there and listening to all of these things happening in my basement and upstairs. And I worked for a psychic line that was really, really popular in the 80s at that time. And I won't mention it, but anyway. So my grandmother said, I'll go down in the basement, Zell. Go, just, I'll go down. What's down there? And I'm like, Grandma, I'm not so sure you could go down there. She said, oh, no. Where's the flashlight? I'll go down. She goes downstairs. She's down there and it's all quiet. And my mom leans over to the basement door. We have it open because we're waiting to hear. We didn't know if we heard Grandma scream, if we would run to help her or we would run away. We laughed about that later, but you're standing there in anticipation with anxiety, thinking, what is going to happen? And my grandmother was very psychically strong, and my mother was a big empath and a big intuitive, and she also worked for that particular line at that time. So we're standing there, and my mom very gingerly gets real close to the basement opening door, and she cups her little hands over her mouth and says, Mom, are you okay down there? And you wait a few seconds, and my mom and I are looking at each other, and you hear her say, Yep, I'll be right up. So up comes my grandmother. Well, I'm going to tell you, she didn't really look as confident and put together as what she did when she went downstairs. And she was very quiet. And later on, we closed the door, and she turned around and she said, you better lock that. And I thought, oh. So it was an old house, and it really didn't have a lock. Door was from out of the kitchen. And this was an old dirt cellar. And in fact, the foundation of this house had been laid earlier by former slaves, and then this house for the Monroes had been built upon this. So it had some history down there. My grandmother turns around and says, Zell, my nickname was Zelkel or Zella, or I guess whatever you want to say. She says, Zell, you better lock that door. So that made me a little uneasy. We went in the living room. We told more stories, and Grandma's demeanor just kind of lightened up a little bit. And you could see that the color was back in her face, and she was refreshed. And then we watched a movie, I think, and we sat out on my porch, and it was time to go to bed. And it was just such an easy time, an easy life. And the next morning, my grandma says, hey, I think we need to go out for breakfast. Okay, where do you want to go? Well, let's go drive up to Williamsburg. So we drove up to Williamsburg, which just steeped with history. And we found this little diner, and we sat there. And my grandmother looks at me and she says, listen here, I don't ever want you to go down in that basement. Ever. When you move, if you have anything down there, which I didn't see anything down there, you send movers down. You send anybody else. You do not go down in that basement. And of course, my mother was just frozen in her tracks. Frozen. She was so animated. She was just sitting there kind of with her mouth open and with her fork right there. And she says, Mom, what was in there? And my grandmother said, I will never tell, but I will tell you this. I hope I never see anything like that again in my life. So, I don't know. I have no idea. I'll never know. And maybe hope I won't ever know what was down there. But anyway, back to the story, my darlings. So you can see the three amigos. That's my grandmother and my mother and I. And I was about 18 years old, something like this. It was summer. And we had been down to Malabar because we always went down there to just mosey around. My grandmother would tell stories. We would take a ride, and for some reason, we would always end up in Malabar. And I said, let's go to Mary Jane's grave. Well, we all looked at each other, and we stopped by this place where we could get cheese and lunch meats and everything else. And my grandmother said, let's have a picnic. And I'm like, hey, I'm all for it. Let's go. Well, the weather forecast was clear that day. In fact, the sky was so blue, there was not a cloud in it. I'll never forget it. And we take this drive. We've got Grandma's Park Avenue. We have Grandma's Park Avenue. We're going down this road. Grandma's driving. I'm in the back seat. We're just chattering because we're just so excited to get there. We have our little picnic. We have our little bottles of root beer. And we are ready to go into this graveyard. We pull up, and the graveyard is at the end of this long, winding, potted trek of overgrown weeds and bushes and trees hanging over the road. And we made it there without a scratch on Grandma's car, thank God. We would have heard about it. But we made it back to this graveyard. And it was, I gotta tell you, one of the most peaceful, non-scary environments that I'd ever been in. It was beautiful and restful. We looked around, and we knew that there was a big pine tree that was there with a heart in the tree. And lo and behold, you know my favorite little saying there, lo and behold, we found this amazing tree. And the tree, and I kid you not, I've got my right hand up right now. This tree had on a heart. Now this tree that had this heart was very, very close to Mary Jane's grave. Now I'm going to tell you, this was not a heart that was carved in. This was a heart that had formed in the tree. It wasn't even in the bark. It was not even in the underside of the bark where it was protruding out. It was formed and a part of the tree. This heart, I will never forget it. And I'm telling you, this heart had these huge, I mean, it was huge. It wasn't just this little dinky heart. It was this big, I'm going to say it had about a 10-inch diameter. Diameter? Yes, I guess. Okay, so there it was there and perfectly formed. I mean, it was like you couldn't have drawn it on there and been formed like that. And of course, Grandma and Mom and I look at each other and we're thinking, whatever. Okay, so we're moseying around and we all just kind of go on our own little separate ways. I mean, the graveyard wasn't that big, so we could, or the cemetery, we could just go in our own directions and still see each other. And we were always, by the way, cautious of dogs and animals. I was always more worried about that than other people at that point. But what I was going to say is that we really didn't pay attention. Poor Mama. I gotta say this. Poor Mama. Mama stood there at Mary Jane's grave. And I had to take a pause there for a minute because I can still see her standing there. And you could tell that there was a moment where my mom kind of got lost in the thought. And that happens for those of you who are intuitive and empaths. You know that happens. You get lost. You get lost in that thought. And I'm seeing my mom standing there right now. So that's why I'm a little distant, because I want to share this with you. My mom, whole demeanor changed. And she was standing there saying, I got to tell you, I'm so sorry, Mary Jane. And this was all heartfelt coming from my mom. I'm so sorry, Mary Jane, for what they did to you, and how they felt about you. I know you were a good person, and I'm not kidding. It started to become dark. Now, of course, in Ohio, it doesn't get dark there in the summer. You're talking 9 o'clock at night. And this was starting to get a little overcast. And my grandma and I look up, and there's some clouds now start rolling in, and one is kind of going over the sun. So I'm telling you, if anybody could set the center stage for look out, something is about to happen, this was it. So Grandma and I start looking at each other, and we look at Mom, and you could hear, because it was so quiet back there, Mom's voice was kind of carrying, so you could hear. And she was going through this oratory of, I'm so sorry, Mary Jane, and blah, 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 and whatever, and all this, and carry on, and blah. And all of a sudden, this wind starts to blow. It not only blows some of the trees, but some of these leaves and debris starts blowing, and they're now blowing around my mom. Well, I'm looking almost in horror to my grandmother, thinking, what are we going to do? Because this looked like it was encapsulating my mom. And so my mom and I, my grandma and I rush up to my mom. My mom, kind of rallies, and she's like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And I said, you know what? I think it's time to go. We hadn't even had our picnic. And we said, we think it's time to go. It's time to go. It's time to go. We think it's time to go. And we got to the car, and just then we heard this huge crack of thunder, and we all screamed because it was out of the blue and it scared us. We laughed hysterically, but it was just like bam. And my mom was so affected by that. So we ran in the car. I told Grandma, I said, I'm driving. We got out of there. We actually went down to Malabar, and the skies were clear. Didn't hear anything more at that time. We parked by this little pond, and we had our picnic, and that was the end. And my mother said, I can't go back there. This is too emotional for me. I can't go back there. Later on in years, when I was a little older, I went back. But when I was 19 years old, yours truly, Zelda, got a job at Malabar Farm, and I took care of the horses, and I was assigned to the AI department. That was the artificial insemination for the cows there. And I worked there for a while, and there's a little area that you can go up. It's a little hill. They call it Mount G's because you drive up there and you can see all over. And they call it Mount G's because you stand up there and you go, geez, it's so pretty. Well, I actually was on a crew, and we dug the post holes for the post up there so no one would accidentally drive over, or, you would know there was a barrier. But it's so wonderful to think back of these events and times, because we lose this. But I wanted to just share this with you today because this is such a big part of my life. And I thank you for being here and sharing it with me. This is such a wonderful honor to do that. But if you have the occasion, and if you're in Ohio, and if you ever want to drive to Malabar Farm, it is still open. You can see the Doris Duke Woods where Shawshank Redemption was filmed. You can drive around, and you might even see the cemetery where Mary Jane was buried. But I gotta tell you, I'm going to put a picture up of this cemetery. This cemetery is called Mount Olive Cemetery. And in 2014, there was a huge gust of wind that came by. And this tree, this beautiful pine tree, fell and crashed into the gravestones of Mary Jane and many others around it. And they are no longer there. And one of the other big trees now has rotted and has fallen. And most of the gravestones are gone. And as of this time right now, I'm not even so sure you can get back and visit. But if you can, look it up. It's Mount Olive Cemetery, and it's off Old Possum Road. And who knows, you might even see a little something back there. I sure hope you do. So I want to thank you for coming and staying with me during this time. I just love it when we visit. So you be well, you be safe, okay, when you're out there doing this sort of thing. You be brave, and you be extremely blessed. And I will see you again very, very soon. This is your friend Zelda Kelly. And don't forget, stop by, I'm whispering now, stop by my House of Zelda Facebook group, and we'll talk about these things. But anyway, you be well, and I'll talk to you very soon. Bye for now. Hey everyone, this is Zelda again. Some of you have asked me, whatever happened to the relationship with Louis Bromfield and my grandparents? Well, in 1942, my grandparents, who were still on the farm, had a very unfortunate accident. You see, my mom, who was in kindergarten, had a little chihuahua, and Louis Bromfield had big boxers. And one time, one of those big boxers came around and bit my mother's little chihuahua on the back, and it killed him. It was such a sad thing, and it was really sad between Louis and my grandfather decided to leave the farm. But he and Louis always kept in touch and were always still very good friends. So there you have it, the backstory. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. I just love this, don't you?